can the Conservatives still win this election, in your view?
It's going to be very tough. I don't think any of us would pretend that is the most likely outcome. We can certainly do a lot better than the polls are suggesting, and we are working very hard to do so.
We thought we'd start, Jeremy, on what is it like on the campaign? You are in a dogfight, a fight to the death in southwest Surrey. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Just to everyone in the audience to give them an idea.
Well, it's different to my day job. I am literally knocking on doors for between 5 and 6 hours every single day, and it's I enjoy it. I have to say it is a brilliant thing to be in a democracy where it doesn't matter who you are, you knock on doors. And the brilliant thing about this country is that literally no one is surprised that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is knocking on their door, asking for their vote. That is how it should be. You guys work for us and not the other way around. A couple of days ago, I knocked on someone's door. I said, "Hello, it's Jeremy Hunt. Just wondered if you wanted to bend my ear about how you're going to vote." And the person looked at me and said, "Yes, but what party are you?" And I said, "Conservative." They said, "Oh yeah, we always vote Conservative." I said, "Thank you very much." And we moved on. So you have quite a lot of interesting exchanges.
I mean, you are actually personally invested in it. You've reportedly put a lot of your own money into the seat. You've been the MP for nearly 20 years now. I mean, do you think you're going to win? Let's put it candidly.
I genuinely, in my seat, I think it's too close to call. I have a very middle-class electorate in Surrey, very highly educated, and actually they have been very mobile voters for all my time in Parliament. So I think it's very hard to call. I still meet a lot of people who say they haven't yet made up their minds. So I genuinely don't know the answer to that question. I've had the conversation with my kids. I may not be an MP after the election, and that's okay. That's democracy, all that sort of stuff. My daughter said to me, "Daddy," she's 12, she said, "Daddy, it's embarrassing that you're Chancellor of the Exchequer, but it'd be embarrassing if you're not Chancellor of the Exchequer, so I don't know which one I want."
On the broader electoral picture, obviously we're waking up this morning, there were 3 mega polls in the space of an hour yesterday which were absolutely brutal. They suggest that the Tories are on course for an unprecedented defeat with different variations of that record. When you read polls like that, what do you think? Do you just ignore them? Do you shut them out? Or do you think actually they could be right? This is heading in the wrong direction.
Well, I don't reject them as being, not worth trying to understand. Of course. I think you have to recognise that we are in a world where voters move around a lot more than the old class-based politics that we used to have. I mean, I remember knocking on doors in the 1980s, and you could virtually predict how someone was going to vote by how their front door looked and how neatly looked after their garden was. And if one person in the family was a Conservative, you'd know the whole family was Conservative. And none of that is the case now. And so people are prepared to move around. You just look at all the elections and referendums that we've had in the last decade, and not just in this country, but around the world. So there are big swings. We are the underdogs, no question about it. But I also do think there are a lot of voters who are still saying to me on the doorstep, they haven't fully made up their mind what they're going to do. And there are lots of different considerations. So I think it's hard to read at this stage, even just 2 weeks away.
So again, candidly, to ask you the same question I asked you about your constituency, can the Conservatives still win this election, in your view?
It's going to be very tough. I don't think any of us would pretend that is the most likely outcome. We can certainly do a lot better than the polls are suggesting, and we are working very hard to do so.
Your colleague Grant Shapps had this concern about a supermajority, this American term, that it could be a thundering victory for Labour that would lead to fundamental democratic issues about checks and balances. Is that a real risk? Do you think that could be a prospect?
I think there are 2 concerns that lots of voters have about an absolutely huge Labour majority. The first is that, in politics, it is harder than running a business. I mean, I ran my own business for 14 years, and in politics there is a lot more scrutiny from people like you, and there are a lot more trade-offs. And so if you have an unchecked majority, it is much easier to play to your instincts on things rather than to make the necessary compromises that I think are usually important for good government. And I think one of the challenges, if Labour do win, is going to be on tax and spend, because all the pressure from the Labour Party, the Labour movement, the unions is going to be to spend more. And in the end, increasing economic growth is a good medium to long-term way to create more money for public services, but it's not going to make a difference in the next year or so. And so I think that may well end up, if that happens, with higher taxes. So I think that is one of the risks. I think there is also a concern that if Labour use that majority to give the votes to 16-year-olds, they could then create a situation in which they have a much larger inbuilt majority for a much longer period of time, and I don't think that would be healthy.
Okay. On the economy, just to move on to the broader economy, we see in France extraordinary stuff that's happening over there with the politics over there for once. They've got all the drama, they've got an instability. Is there an argument now that actually Britain could be a safer destination for an investment given the kind of political and economic turmoil that we're seeing in France?
Look, I think we are a haven of stability compared to many parts of Europe and many parts of the world. But I actually think that we have been a brilliant destination for investment for some time. And many people in this room will have heard me make the argument, but the industries that are going to grow the fastest in this century are sectors where we are very, very strong in the UK. We now have a tech sector that is double the size of Germany, is 3 times the size of France. The 2 global centres for AI are San Francisco and London. Life sciences is an area where we become Europe's undisputed leader. We're very, very good in clean energy, advanced manufacturing, some way behind Germany, but we are doing very, very well in the high end of our manufacturing sector. And film and TV, we are by far the biggest in Europe. I think Netflix spent $6 billion making stuff here in the last 4 years. So we have got some very, very strong sectors. We do have a more pro-business entrepreneurial culture than many parts of Europe. We've had our ups and downs over the last decade, but I think, if you look at yesterday's inflation numbers, you can see now we've got the lowest inflation of any G7 country bar Italy. Our investment is growing faster than countries like America and Germany because of the super deduction and full expensing. There are lots of things we need to fix, and I think the big debate we need to be having is how do we increase our growth rate from between 1% and 2% to closer to 3%. And we need to think about how to do that. But there are big opportunities to do so. I mean, I speak as someone who voted to remain, but I think one of the biggest Brexit opportunities is the autonomy that we have over our regulatory system. I see Nikhil here from the FCA, but we've been able to do things in the last couple of years with the regulatory autonomy that we have over financial services that is making London, the city, our FS sector, much more competitive. And that is one of the reasons why we haven't seen this big drain of bankers going from the UK to Europe in the way that was predicted 5 years ago. And I think we can do that in our life sciences sector, in many of our areas. So I think there are some very big opportunities.
There's obviously an interest rate decision today, without commenting directly on that for obvious reasons, but clearly interest rates are going to start falling. Do you see that coming? I mean, one of the things that has kind of bewildered me about the decision to go early with the election is we've got inflation at 2%, you've got the prospect of interest rate cuts on the horizon. Why go early before you've actually reaped any potential political benefits of that?
I just think the electorate are much too sophisticated to be swayed by, there was a 1/4 point drop in interest rates or a particular economic figure. I think they're making a much bigger judgment about their future than that. But it is very good news. Inflation down from 11% to 2%. The prospect now is of moving down to much lower interest rates. As Chancellor, you are interested in, first of all, the impact on families with mortgages, because people have been having a very tough time, but also the impact on public finances. If our long-term debt costs start to fall, that can be very significant when you're planning fiscal events, because there's a lot of pressure in the system.
The Prime Minister's described the legacy he inherited from Liz Truss as the biggest hospital pass in history, in political history. Is that a fair characterisation, that you're actually being blamed in many ways for the sins of the past, that that turmoil is something that the Tory brand has never been able to shake off?
Well, I think, you have to ask voters about who they blame for what. What I would say is that in terms of, certainly for me, it was it was the most dramatic week in my life in terms of decisions I had to take when I got that rather unexpected call from Liz Truss asking me to be Chancellor, which I thought was a hoax, and refused to take the call, and thought it was absolute. I could not imagine any situation ever where Liz Truss would actually ask me to be Chancellor. So that was a bit surreal. And then in that first week, literally unpicking the entire mini budget. But I don't think it's fair to say that there was a sustained economic scarring from that. I think if you look at us now with lower inflation than most major economies, higher growth than most major economies, we're actually doing very well. I think the real impact on the economy and the reason for the hardship that so many people felt was because following Ukraine, interest rates went up at precisely the moment us and nearly every other economy had massively increased our debt to pay for support during COVID. So you had an extra 360 billion quid on the national debt because of our furlough scheme and the other COVID support scheme. Absolutely the right thing to do. But that money had been borrowed on the basis that interest rates would be low. And suddenly, because of what Putin did, they went up. And that was the root cause of the shock and the fiscal consolidation that I had to do in the autumn statement of 22.
We should talk about one of the elephants in the room. The thing that's killing the Conservative Party is Nigel Farage and reform and what his party's doing. Now, we did an interview with David Cameron last week in which he accused Nigel Farage of inflammatory rhetoric. He said it was using dog whistle politics to get voters. Do you think attacks like that are a bit counterproductive, given that many of your voters actually like Nigel Farage?
Well, I have a lot of discussions on the doorstep with people who, when I'm knocking on doors, some people are thinking Conservative or Lib Dem, other people are thinking Conservative or Reform. And my argument to Reform voters, which is obviously what I would say in my constituency, is that if you vote Reform, you're not going to get a Reform MP, you're going to get a Lib Dem MP. And if that happens all over the country, what you will have is fewer centre-right MPs who believe that it is fundamentally very important that we do the hard work to keep the tax level as it is and start to bring it down. And as this is an audience of business people, I just want to take a moment on this point, if I may, because I do think that, when you cut through, I have a lot of respect for Rachel Reeves. I like her as a person. And I think, what is the big difference between her approach, if she becomes Chancellor, and my approach? It does boil down to tax. Fundamentally, I look around the world and I think that the fastest growing economies are in North America and Asia, where taxes are generally lower as a proportion of GDP. Now, economists will have an enormous debate about cause and correlation, but I think there is cause, because I think when you have lower taxes, you have a more vibrant private sector, you create more headroom for investment, and in the end, that means you have more money to spend on public services like the NHS, schools, roads, defence, all these different things. So the Labour perspective is that, they believe taxation is broadly a force for good because, they believe that for social justice reasons. And they are content with tax levels as they are. In fact, the Labour manifesto is actually planning to increase taxes by about 8 billion a year. If we're going to bring down taxes, and I'm speaking as the Chancellor who put them up, significantly, it is a lot of hard work, it is a lot of discipline. But I think that is very, very important for our economic future, and I think you have to do the hard work. Now, the next question is, with all these pressures on public finances that people like Paul Johnson talk about, how on earth are you going to manage that? And the answer is, you have to have a credible public sector productivity program, because I want us to have fantastic public services. I want to train more doctors and nurses for the NHS. I want to invest in our education system. I think it's particularly important that we invest more in defence, given what we're seeing from Putin and Xi Jinping. So this is not about, public squalor, private wealth. I want to have money in our public services. So you then have to say, well, the only way you can square the circle is by a really imaginative, determined public sector productivity program. And that's what I started to do in the budget. I did a deal with the NHS, where in return for giving them £3.4 billion to improve their IT systems, they agreed to increase their productivity by 2% a year. And if we can roll that out across the whole of the public sector, now you guys in the private sector would say 2% a year is absolutely nothing. If you gave me that as an objective, I would snap it up. But in the public sector, it is harder, for all sorts of reasons. But the NHS did 1.5% a year between 2010 and 2019. So I think they can do 2%. The rest of the public sector, I think they can do it as well. If you do that, it is possible to contain public spending within the 1% real terms growth spending assumption without damaging austerity-style cuts. And that's the path that I started us on in the budget. And if we do that, I think we can continue to bring down taxes if alongside that you also do something else that's very important, which is welfare reform. I'll just say one other point. Sorry, Stephen. On economic growth. I think the big thing that we need to be talking about more in terms of economic growth is labour supply. Because outside the EU, we don't have access to that vast pool of labour that we had when we were in the single market. You have to have an answer to that question. My answer is, in this country, we have 6 million adults of working age who are not in work. Now, you guys, across the UK economy, the total number of vacancies is about 900,000. So we could potentially fill our vacancies 5 or 6 times over if we tapped into that labour market pool. That's why in every fiscal event I've done something for labour supply. The childcare measures to get parents back to work, getting rid of the lifetime allowance on pensions to stop people in their 50s, particularly doctors, being forced to retire early, the reforms to unemployment benefit, toughening up the sanctions, and the reforms to sickness benefit, changing the way fit notes work, Mel Stride's Back to Work programme. That, I think, is going to be absolutely critical for growth, because if we're going to genuinely have 2 to 3% growth, you guys have got to know that you can recruit the people to enable you to do that.
I think we are nearly out of time, Chancellor. Thank you very much. Just on you personally, what do you do after this if you lose? Do you go to the shepherd's hut? Do you kind of retire? Or do you have another career in business? What do you want to do?
Well, obviously, I'm not expecting to lose, Stephen. But in that situation, look, I set up and ran my own business for 14 years. But I've spent a long time in the private sector. And I want to be in public service, whatever way, shape or form that takes. That's what I like to do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chancellor.
Thank you.